At 37, Yoervis Medina's final drive began like any other afternoon in Naguanagua, Venezuela. The sun hung low over the palm-lined streets, the kind of calm that makes you forget tragedy could ever exist. But that calm shattered in a heartbeat. Witnesses said they heard the screech of tires, the sound of glass exploding, and then silence, heavy, unnatural silence. By the time the paramedics arrived, the once celebrated Major League pitcher lay motionless behind the wheel. A man who had once faced roaring stadiums now faced eternity alone on an empty road. Officially, they called it a heart attack. But among those who knew him, whispers of exhaustion, of mounting pressure, of a man who carried more than his body could bear. An investigator later described the scene with chilling precision. No signs of struggle, just sudden collapse. Yet in that single moment, a whole career, a life, and a quiet legacy of talent and pain were extinguished. His former teammates from Seattle to Chicago flooded social media with disbelief. His mother, when told the news, simply said, "He left too early." But maybe he was already tired. Journalists replayed his final interviews, hunting for clues. Fans reposted clips of his fiercest pitches, the ones that once silenced entire stadiums. In those replays, you can almost feel what he carried, something heavier than fame, something deeper than fatigue. That afternoon drive was not just the end of a man's journey. It was the closing chapter of a dream that began in the slums of Puerto Cabello, where a young boy threw stones at tin cans and imagined they were baseballs. The road to glory was long, the fall instant. Before tragedy wrote his name in headlines, Yoervis Medina was the quiet storm of Major League Baseball. To the casual fan, he was a middle reliever, the man who came in after the starter faltered, cleaned up the mess, and walked away with no spotlight. But to those who watched him closely, Medina was more than that. He was the pulse of the game, a pitcher whose right arm could burn through fear itself. Born in Puerto Cabello, Venezuela, he grew up in a world of cracked pavement and endless noise. His neighborhood wasn't the kind where children dreamed of stadium lights. Yet even there, between rusted fences and dusty fields, Medina found rhythm. He was the boy who threw bottle caps instead of baseballs, who studied the curve of flight as though he could command the air itself. A childhood friend later said, "He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. You could hear his dreams in the sound of the ball hitting the wall." When scouts from the Seattle Mariners spotted him in 2005, Medina was barely 17. He didn't speak English, didn't have a passport, and barely believed that such things as contracts could reach him. But the Mariners saw something raw, the fire behind the quiet eyes. He signed, boarded a plane for the first time, and left behind his mother's trembling hands in a town that still whispered his name for weeks after. As Medina rose through the minor leagues, he built his reputation not on arrogance, but precision. Teammates described him as ice calm even when the game was burning. His pitches had that uncanny quality movement that defied geometry, a fastball that seemed alive. By 2013, he finally walked into the stadium of his dreams, his MLB debut with the Seattle Mariners. The crowd didn't know his name then, but when he stepped onto that mound, something electric shifted. Commentators said his first strikeout was pure poetry in motion, yet success didn't change him. To journalists, he remained elusive, polite, professional, almost invisible outside the field. He refused interviews that focused on his past. Perhaps he already understood how fragile the bridge between fame and peace could be. In 2014, Medina reached his prime, 66 appearances, a 2.68 ERA, and whispers of an all-star future. Fans began to call him the Venezuelan Flame. But inside, Medina was fighting a silence. No camera could catch the loneliness of foreign hotels, the pressure of perfection, the fading contact with the family he left behind. A reporter once asked him what he missed most about Venezuela. He paused for several seconds before replying, "The sound of the sea when it's quiet. It reminds me that even storms must rest." When he was traded to the Chicago Cubs in 2015, many thought it would be his rebirth. It wasn't. His appearances dwindled. His confidence cracked. The fans who once cheered began to forget. Behind the scenes, those close to him noticed a man shrinking inside his own shadow. One former teammate would later tell a local paper, "Yoervis had this habit before every game he'd rub his chest and breathe deep, like he was fighting something invisible. That something would haunt him long after his MLB chapter closed. He played briefly overseas, still chasing the echo of that first thunderous crowd. Yet every flight home seemed longer, every silence heavier. From the outside, it looked like a slow fade. But for those who knew the boy from Puerto Cabello, it was a tragedy unfolding in slow motion, the dream that once lifted him, now pressing him down. He never made headlines for scandals, never stirred controversy. His life wasn't marked by noise, but by quiet disappearance, the kind that leaves you wondering how many people vanish like this, silently, while the world scrolls past. And on that final October day, when his car drifted across the road, the world remembered his name again. Too late, too brief. Long before the roar of stadiums and the blinding flash of cameras, Yoervis Medina's world was a mosaic of salt air, old radios, and the metallic echo of a baseball striking a wall. Puerto Cabello, the coastal town where he was born, was equal parts paradise and struggle. The sea was beautiful, but it didn't feed you. His father was a mechanic. His mother worked odd jobs, cleaning small stores near the harbor. Money was always short, but faith was abundant. They believed in hard work, in quiet pride, in the strange miracles that sometimes came to those who refused to give up. Neighbors remember Medina as the boy who never stopped moving. When others played soccer, he practiced throwing stones at tin cans. When rain flooded the narrow streets, he'd turn puddles into imaginary pitching mounds. He had no toys, one neighbor recalled, but every day, he created something out of nothing. At school, Medina was gentle, often too quiet for teachers to notice him. But during recess, he transformed. He challenged older boys to throwing contests and win, every time. By 13, his right arm had developed a rhythm that seemed almost supernatural. He didn't know the science of torque, spin, or release. He just knew how to make the ball move. His mother once said to a local newspaper years later, "He wasn't loud like other kids, but when he threw that ball, he spoke." The streets of Puerto Cabello were full of music, gossip, and stories of people who left and never came back. For many, baseball was the only escape. Scouts occasionally passed through town, searching for talent buried in poverty. Medina waited for years, training in the dark, playing barefoot with a ball that had lost its stitching. Then, one afternoon in 2005, fate knocked. A scout from the Seattle Mariners' Latin American program stopped by a local field after hearing about a kid who could throw lightning. Medina, 17, was shy and unsure. But when he stepped on the mound, the scout's silence said everything. That same week, the Mariners offered him a contract. The signing bonus wasn't much, a few $1,000s, but to Medina's family, it felt like salvation. They celebrated with a homemade cake and music from a borrowed radio. That night, he promised his mother he would build her a house. "Not big," he said, "just one that doesn't leak when it rains." The next morning, he boarded a bus to Caracas to get his visa. It was his first time leaving home. His mother handed him a rosary. His father, a handshake, stiff, proud, wordless. From there, Medina's life became a whirlwind of change. In the United States, he didn't understand the language, the food, or the culture. Teammates laughed at his broken English. He missed the scent of sea salt, the laughter of his sisters. Letters from home were rare, calls expensive. One early coach from the Mariners farm system recalled, he'd sit alone after practice, staring at his glove like it was the only friend he had. But even in that isolation, Medina burned with quiet determination. During one minor league season, he sent almost all his small salary back home. His mother later told a Venezuelan radio host, "He never bought himself anything. He only asked if we were eating well." By the time he turned 25, Medina had carved his place among the Mariners' rising prospects. Yet, even then, success seemed bittersweet. His father's health was failing. The economic crisis in Venezuela had made visits home nearly impossible. From the outside, he looked like a man living the dream. Inside, he was a son who couldn't go back, who feared the world would move on without him. When he finally made his MLB debut in 2013, the Mariners clubhouse was electric. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked him what it felt like to stand on that mound. Medina smiled softly and said, "It feels like home, just louder." That answer was pure Medina, humble, understated, but carrying oceans of emotion. Even as the crowd roared, he kept one ritual. Every time he took the mound, he'd look up for a second, not at the scoreboard, but at the sky, and whisper something in Spanish. A teammate once asked what he said. Medina replied, "For my mother. She still prays every time I pitch." The boy from Puerto Cabello had made it. But in the quiet moments between games, the loneliness still crept in. His success was real, yet somehow it didn't fill the spaces it was meant to. And that emptiness, that quiet shadow, would follow him for the rest of his life. When Yoervis Medina first arrived in America, everything felt too bright, too loud, too fast. The lights of the minor leagues were a world away from Puerto Cabello's sunsets. He was just a name stitched on a jersey, a foreign kid who spoke little English but threw harder than anyone expected. In those early years with the Seattle Mariners farm system, Medina learned that baseball in the United States wasn't just a game, it was a machine. Coaches didn't have time for hesitation, and mistakes weren't forgiven twice. He had to adapt quickly, translating not only language but culture, discipline, and the rhythm of ambition. One teammate remembered, "He barely talked, but you always heard the sound of that ball cutting air." When Yoervis threw, people stopped to watch. The coaches saw something raw, an unpredictable fastball, a curve that dropped like gravity itself, and a focus that made him seem older than his years. But behind his calm face, Medina was fighting anxiety, the kind that comes when you're chasing a dream thousands of miles from home with no safety net if you fall. Letters from Venezuela became his emotional anchor. His mother's handwriting reminded him who he was. "We're proud," she wrote once, "but please, eat. Don't forget to rest." He didn't rest. Between 2007 and 2012, Medina climbed through the Mariners minor league system, Wisconsin, Jackson, Tacoma, the names of cities that blurred into one long road trip. He lived out of suitcases, motel rooms, and cheap apartments with other Latin players who shared the same hunger and homesickness. They called themselves Los Invisibles, the invisible ones, the players nobody recognized unless they struck gold. Then, in April 2013, Medina's moment finally arrived. The Mariners called him up to the major leagues. The day he stepped onto the mound for the first time, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Gracias, mama." The crowd had no idea who he was, but his first pitch, a fastball at 96 miles per hour, silenced the noise. Then came a second, sharper, deadlier. The batter swung and missed, and just like that, a legend was born in Seattle. From the bullpen, older players nodded. They saw that rare mix of control and chaos that defines greatness. Commentators began calling him Seattle's secret weapon. The next 2 seasons would mark the peak of his early career. In 2014, he appeared in 66 games, maintaining an ERA of 2.68, extraordinary for a reliever. But what impressed his coaches wasn't just his performance, it was his discipline. He trained before dawn, refused to party, and called his family after every win. Still, not everything was triumph. The pressure to maintain perfection weighed on him like lead. When he faltered, he punished himself. Once, after giving up a decisive hit, he sat in the locker room long after everyone had left, staring at the floor. His pitching coach approached and said, "You did good." Medina shook his head. "Good isn't enough," he replied. In the Mariners clubhouse, some joked that he carried two versions of himself, the calm pitcher everyone admired, and the quiet soul slowly unraveling. By 2015, rumors began to swirl about possible trades. The Mariners were restructuring, and despite his strong record, Medina's name appeared on the list. When he was finally traded to the Chicago Cubs, reporters expected excitement. Instead, Medina smiled faintly and said, "It's still baseball. The mound is the same everywhere." But it wasn't the same. Chicago brought colder weather, higher expectations, and less warmth. The Cubs already had a stacked bullpen, and Medina struggled to find his place. He pitched in only a handful of games before being sent down again. The energy he once carried began to flicker. Friends noticed his silence deepening. "He was there," one teammate recalled, "but it was like he'd left already." Back in Venezuela, his mother could sense it too. "He sounded tired," she told a local station after his death. Not of baseball, of being far away. After leaving the Cubs, Medina drifted through smaller contracts in minor leagues, in Mexico, and finally in Italy, where he joined Tecnograniti Sanago in 2023. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful final chapter. But even there, surrounded by new fans and slower rhythms, he seemed distant. An Italian teammate said later, "He was kind, respectful, but he smiled like someone remembering something painful." Yoervis Medina had lived what millions only dream of, yet he remained in exile in his own success. The boy who once conquered major league hitters was now a quiet man, driving alone through Venezuelan streets, far from the cheers that once defined him. His rise was dazzling, his fade invisible. And as fate would have it, the next chapter of his story wouldn't unfold in the stadium lights, but on a silent road where everything ended in seconds. By the summer of 2014, Yoervis Medina was at the height of his powers, and yet he never looked like the type to notice. No expensive cars, no gold chains, just a quiet man walking into the Mariners clubhouse, carrying a glove and the weight of his own expectations. That year, the Mariners were struggling for consistency, and Medina became the man the team turned to when everything seemed to be falling apart. He was the calm in the chaos the reliever called when bases were loaded, when pressure could break lesser men. The commentators called his pitching surgical. Teammates called it unreal. When he walked to the mound, the stadium's noise dimmed to a hum. Fans leaned forward because they knew Medina meant control. In 2014, his numbers spoke for themselves: 66 games, 2.68 ERA, and a strikeout-to-walk ratio that made analysts whisper about all-star potential. But stats can't capture presence, and Medina had that rare energy, the quiet gravity that made other players feel safe just knowing he was warming up. A journalist once wrote, "Watching Medina pitch is like watching someone pray. It's not loud, it's not flashy, it's sacred." In interviews, he gave little away. When asked what kept him calm under pressure, he smiled softly and said, "The ball listens when you respect it." In Stop and Sit about the shamans and Nisans of the Taj, he didn't know it then, but that humility, that refusal to believe he was untouchable, was what made him beloved not just in Seattle, but across Latin America. Venezuelan fans followed every game, waking up at odd hours to watch their hometown hero. Sports channels replayed his highlights with patriotic pride. Back home, children painted his name on worn-out baseballs. His mother, who still lived in Puerto Cabello, became something of a local legend herself. People would stop her at markets, asking about her son's next game. "He's working hard," she'd always reply. But the higher he climbed, the heavier the air became. Fame didn't change Medina, it isolated him. The constant travel, the hotel rooms, the empty celebrations, it all began to blur. He had no entourage, no headlines about parties or feuds, only a routine: pitch, call his mother, sleep, repeat. Some mistook his solitude for arrogance. Others saw what it truly was: exhaustion. Former teammate Charlie Furbush once said, "He was the most focused guy I've ever seen. But when the game ended, you could see something in his eyes, like he was somewhere else." The 2014 season ended with Medina as one of the most dependable relief pitchers in the league. But baseball is cruel in its short memory. By the start of 2015, management shifts and new signings began pushing him toward uncertainty. He was traded to the Chicago Cubs in May, a deal meant to fill roster needs, not to honor what he'd built. Seattle fans were stunned. "He deserved better," one journalist tweeted. "He gave us everything." In Chicago, the media barely noticed his arrival. He played in a handful of games before being moved again from the majors to the minors, then out of the spotlight entirely. For a man who had reached the peak, this fall was quiet but devastating. Still, Medina never spoke bitterly. When asked about the trade, he told a local reporter, "It's part of the game. You throw, you fight, you move on." But behind the curtain, those who knew him saw the change. He'd started rubbing his chest before every pitch, taking deep breaths, as if grounding himself against something invisible. Coaches assumed it was a ritual. Teammates thought it was stress. Only later would it become a haunting detail. In 2016, Medina's major league chapter closed. For the world, it was the end of a player's run. For him, it was the loss of identity. Baseball had been his language, his passport, his heartbeat. Without it, silence took over. He continued to play in smaller leagues: Venezuela, Mexico, Italy, refusing to give up. But it wasn't about fame anymore. It was about belonging. During one of his final interviews in 2023, while playing for Tecnogranity Sinago in Italy, Medina said something eerily prophetic. "People think the hardest thing is losing the game. No, the hardest thing is losing yourself after the game." He laughed lightly after saying it, as if he didn't want it to sound too serious. But those who watch the clip now can't unhear it. There's a tiredness in his tone, the quiet resignation of a man who knew he was fading from memory, even while still alive. Yet, for those who followed his career, Medina's peak was never about awards or headlines. It was about grace under pressure, humility in triumph, and strength in silence. He was the boy who came from nothing and conquered the impossible. The pitcher who, for one perfect season, stood at the center of a roaring stadium and made time stop. And as the cheers of that peak slowly dissolved into years of silence, one truth lingered. Greatness is not always measured by how high you rise, but by how quietly you carry the weight when you fall. The road from glory to silence is rarely straight. For Yoervis Medina, it was a slow descent, quiet, almost polite. There were no scandals, no public meltdowns, no viral interviews, just the gradual fading of a man who once made stadiums roar. After leaving Major League Baseball, Medina drifted between minor leagues and international clubs, trying to keep alive the rhythm that had once defined him. He played in Mexico, then later in Italy, smiling for photos, always respectful, always reserved. But behind those smiles, friends said something had changed. One Italian teammate recalled, he was kind, always helping younger players. But sometimes after games, he'd sit in the locker room long after everyone else had gone, just staring at his glove, like it held memories he couldn't let go of. In interviews, he brushed off questions about returning to the U.S. I'm happy, he'd say. I have peace here. But those who knew him well noticed how often he mentioned home, Venezuela, his mother, the sound of the sea. In early 2025, Medina returned to Venezuela for what was supposed to be a break, a few weeks with family, maybe coaching young pitchers. Friends described him as quiet, thinner, but still strong. He posted little on social media, no signs of distress. Yet, behind the stillness, whispers grew about fatigue, heart problems, and the toll of years on the road. Then came the 30th of October 2025, the day that ended everything. Around 4:30 p.m., on a stretch of road in Naguanagua, Carabobo, Medina's car swerved unexpectedly and collided with several parked vehicles. The impact was minor, almost too minor to explain the outcome. Witnesses rushed to help, but when they reached the car, Medina was motionless. His hands still clutched the steering wheel. The first police report suggested a cardiac event, sudden heart failure. No alcohol, no speed, no struggle, just stillness. But what followed wasn't just grief, it was confusion. The local police report was clinical. Driver lost consciousness, no sign of foul play. But among fans, teammates, and even journalists, questions began to circulate. A Venezuelan sports writer, Carlos Áñez, published a chilling column. Yoervis Medina's story cannot end with a sentence that short. Healthy men don't simply stop living at 37. What broke his heart before his heart broke? In Morking Bad, in an next one is Hafter of Dutron, investigators interviewed family and friends, tracing his last 24 hours. He had visited his mother that morning, eaten breakfast with her, and gone for a short drive. He told her he was thinking about starting something new, maybe coaching. He seemed hopeful, she told reporters through tears. He said he was finally at peace. But that night, the streets of Puerto Cabello filled with whispers. Some said he'd been exhausted for weeks, suffering chest pains but refusing medical help. Others believed it was more emotional than physical. The loneliness, the weight of unspoken disappointment. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from Seattle, Chicago, and beyond. Former Mariners pitcher Felix Hernandez posted a photo of them laughing during practice, writing, "Rest easy, brother. You gave us pride." This speary dot on the wine. Yet the more the tributes came, the heavier the silence around the cause grew. No autopsy details were released. The family asked for privacy. Reporters backed off. But fans never stop asking. One journalist described his funeral as eerily quiet. The coffin draped in the Venezuelan flag, his old Mariners cap placed beside it. Teammates sent wreaths. His mother stood still, her hand on the casket, whispering prayers no one could hear. A former coach attended and later told a local radio show, "What hurts most is that he died the same way he lived, quietly, gracefully, without demanding attention." But even as tributes faded, the mystery deepened. Some fans speculated about health issues, others about depression. In one online forum, a Venezuelan journalist hinted at personal struggles never disclosed to the press. It is rapids to crawl. It wasn't the kind of gossip you see with celebrities. There was no scandal, no dark secret to sensationalize, only unanswered questions. Was it exhaustion? Isolation? A body worn down by years of quiet sacrifice? A Seattle reporter, revisiting his 2014 archives, wrote poignantly, "He was a man who never complained, even when his heart might have been screaming." In the final days of October, as his name trended online for the first time in years, fans shared clips of his best pitches, those blistering fastballs that once carved fear into hitters' eyes. "Gone too soon," they wrote. "Our silent storm, From the police's point of view, it was an accident caused by fate. From the families, a tragedy too cruel to comprehend. From his friends, a warning that even strength breaks when it carries too much alone. But to the fans, to those who still remember that night in 2014, when he silenced a stadium with a perfect strike, Yoervis Medina's death became something larger, a haunting echo of how fleeting greatness really is. The tragedy wasn't just that he died young, it was that, in his quiet humility, the world almost forgot he had lived. In the last 2 years of his life, Yoervis Medina lived like a man who had already made peace with both his triumphs and his ghosts. He wasn't chasing glory anymore, just moments of calm. After leaving the major leagues, he found small joys in simplicity. Coaching kids, visiting his old neighborhood in Puerto Cabello, and spending afternoons watching the sea with his mother. He used to say the waves reminded him of the sound of a crowd, she told a Venezuelan reporter. But now the sea was quieter, and he liked it that way. In Sturden Sitter Shavrages is Avery, he had stopped talking about comebacks. Baseball, once his whole identity, had become something sacred, something he didn't need to prove anymore. Instead, he helped local youth teams, teaching kids how to grip a fastball and, more importantly, how to stay humble when they succeeded. One of his young trainees later posted a message online. Coach Medina said winning means nothing if you can't sleep at night. He said peace is the best trophy. That line would echo tragically after his death. Friends said that Medina was happy but also reflective. He talked often about balance between ambition and peace, noise and silence. He'd begun reading philosophy books in Spanish translation, often quoting Marcus Aurelius to his teammates in Italy. You have power over your mind, not outside events. But even serenity has cracks. A former teammate in Sinago recalled, sometimes after games he'd sit alone, just breathing slow, hand on his chest. He said it was nothing, just fatigue. But he did that more and more often. Doctors in Italy had once advised him to undergo a full cardiac checkup. He promised he would after returning home. No one knows if he ever did. In early 2025, he told a friend he wanted to spend more time with family, to breathe Venezuelan air again. He moved back, quietly, with little fanfare. Neighbors would occasionally see him jogging early in the morning, smiling, waving at old friends. Life seemed calm, almost too calm. Then came the final day, the 30th of October 2025. He woke up early, ate breakfast with his mother, eggs, coffee, bread. He told her he'd drive to Naguanagua to meet an old friend. They talked about the future. He wanted to open a small academy for young pitchers, something pure and close to home. When he left, he hugged her longer than usual. She later told reporters, I didn't know that was goodbye. He said, don't worry, Mama, I'll be back for dinner. He never made it home. Around 4:30 that afternoon, the accident occurred. His car crossed the divider and struck two parked vehicles. No alcohol, no high speed, just a quiet end to a quiet man. Witnesses said the car came to rest against a tree. Medina's eyes were closed, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, as if holding on to something beyond the road. Perhaps one last pitch, one last memory, one last prayer. When news broke, it spread fast through Venezuela, then across the baseball world. But the shock wasn't the noise, it was the silence that followed. Seattle's official account posted, we are deeply saddened by the passing of Yoervis Medina. His quiet strength left a lasting mark on this franchise. The comment section filled with thousands of fans. Some remembered his legendary 2014 season. Others shared stories of how he stayed late after games to sign autographs for kids. His mother didn't attend the first press conference. She stayed home, clutching his old glove, whispering prayers. He used to say, every throw was for me, she told a local paper later. Now I think every wave in the sea is for him. The man who once commanded the stadiums of the world had returned home to silence, but not absence. His story became a candle for anyone who had chased a dream and paid for it with their peace. In the weeks after Yoervis Medina's death, something remarkable began to happen. Across Venezuela, from the crowded streets of Puerto Cabello to the small fields where children played barefoot, his name returned whispered, honored, reborn. He had never been a superstar by American standards. But in the hearts of those who understood struggle, Medina became something greater, a symbol of quiet dignity. His story wasn't about scandal or fortune, it was about resilience. A boy who rose from dust and salt air to stand among the world's best, then walked away without bitterness when the applause faded. That humility struck a nerve. Venezuelan media began calling him El Lanzador, invisible, the invisible pitcher. Not because he was forgotten, but because he represented every man who gave his life to a dream without needing the world to see. Sports journalists revisited his 2014 highlights, calling it a masterclass in balance and control. One American columnist wrote, "He was never the loudest man on the field, but when Yoervis Medina threw a pitch, silence followed, and that's how you know you're in the presence of something sacred." Former teammates described him as a rare soul, gentle, humble, focused. Many said he was the glue in the Mariners' bullpen, the one who prayed before every game, who reminded others to breathe when pressure peaked. One of them, Danny Farquhar, told ESPN Latin, "Yoervis taught me that strength isn't about volume. It's about how long you can hold your silence before you break." In Puerto Cabello, a small mural appeared near the ballpark where he first trained Medina mid-pitch, eyes calm, with the words "El silencio también gana," silence also wins. For local kids, he became a new kind of hero. Not the flashy athlete on magazine covers, but the man who proved that greatness could exist without spectacle. Coaches began invoking his name when teaching discipline. "Watch Medina," they'd say. "He never threw angry, he threw honest." In the broader world of sports, Medina's passing reignited discussion about the mental and physical toll on athletes, especially those who live far from home. Sports psychologists cited his case when talking about loneliness in global leagues, the invisible burden of those who succeed in silence. One MLB mental health advocate told reporters, "Yoervis Medina's death reminds us that athletes are not machines. They carry pressure, isolation, and identity loss, and too often, they do it alone." In Seattle, fans left flowers and baseballs outside T-Mobile Park. A few even held candlelight vigils, writing notes that read, "Thank you for the quiet moments." One fan wrote simply, "You never knew us, but you made us proud." For Venezuela, Medina's story became part of a larger cultural memory alongside musicians, poets, and athletes who carried the nation's spirit across borders. He embodied the bittersweet truth of migration. To succeed abroad is often to be lonely in success. Years from now, when statistics fade and highlight reels are buried under new seasons, what will remain of Yoervis Medina is not a number but an energy. The energy of a man who faced pressure without arrogance, who chased dreams without vanity, and who met death with the same calm that once defined his pitch. He did not live loudly, but he lived truthfully. And that, perhaps, is why his story continues to ripple across oceans, across memories, across every soul who has ever fought quietly for something that mattered. In the end, his legacy is not about baseball. It's about endurance, about grace, about knowing that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told in whispers. There's something haunting about Yoervis Medina's story, not because it ends in tragedy, but because it's a mirror of how easily we forget the quiet ones. In a world addicted to noise, Medina lived differently. He didn't chase cameras. He didn't demand attention. He played, he gave, and when the light faded, he walked away without resentment. It's easy to glorify legends who shout their victories. But Medina's greatness was subtle, and that's what makes it profound. He represented a kind of purity we rarely see anymore. An athlete who played for the love of the game, not for the empire around it. When the headlines first broke, former Mariners pitcher Yoervis Medina dies at 37. Most people saw it, paused for a second, and scrolled on. But those who remembered him felt a different kind of grief. Because Medina's story is not about losing a player. It's about losing a reminder of what humility looks like in a world that's forgotten it. From the court's perspective, his death was natural causes. From investigators, no foul play. But from a human perspective, from ours, it's something deeper. It's what happens when years of pressure, loneliness, and unspoken fatigue collect quietly inside someone who never complains. In a way, Medina's story exposes the silent price of excellence. Behind every fastball, every clean inning, there's a cost no statistic captures: the missed birthdays, the empty hotel rooms, the language barriers, the emotional hunger. For years, Medina carried that cost like a shadow no one saw until it was too late. But even within that sadness, there's something luminous. He never let bitterness win. He kept showing up for the game, for his family, for the kids he coached. He didn't chase glory, he passed it on. And maybe that's the lesson his story leaves us with. Success doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, Sometimes the ones who teach us the most are the ones who never ask to be seen. Yoervis Medina's life reminds us that tragedy doesn't always wear the face of scandal or excess. Sometimes it's the quietest hearts that break the hardest. As a channel that tells stories of forgotten celebrities, we often explore downfall, mystery, and loss. But in Medina's case, it feels different. His story doesn't accuse anyone. It simply invites us to look closer at the unseen toll of chasing perfection, at the fragile line between passion and peace, at the humanity inside every hero. So, when the crowd goes silent and the cameras fade, maybe that's when the real story begins, the story of the person behind the player. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it. That faint sound of a baseball striking leather. The heartbeat of a man who gave everything and asked for nothing. When the sun sets over Porto Cabello, the ocean glows like a memory restless, endless, alive. Locals say that if you stand near the old harbor at dusk, you can still hear the faint rhythm of a ball striking a wall. They call it El Eco de Yoervis, the echo of Yoervis. Children play on the same cracked pavement where he once practiced barefoot. They don't remember every statistic, but they know the story, the boy who threw lightning and dreamed of lifting his family from the storms. The man who reached the major leagues, conquered fear, and then disappeared with the same quiet grace he lived by. His mother still visits the field sometimes, carrying his old glove. She doesn't speak when she walks past the murals. She just looks up at the sky, as if waiting for one last pitch. "He's not gone," she once said softly to a journalist. "He just went home early." And maybe that's true. Maybe Yoervis Medina was never meant to be one of the loud ones, the brash legends who fill tabloids and documentaries. Maybe his story was meant to remind us of something gentler, that greatness doesn't always roar, that peace is also a victory, and that even when the world stops watching, some lives keep shining quietly. In the end, the tragedy of Yoervis Medina is not just in how he died, but in how the world almost forgot him. Yet that's what makes his memory powerful, because now we remember. In a universe obsessed with fame, Medina's silence is its own kind of rebellion. He was proof that not every story of glory ends with scandal or shame. Some simply fade into stillness, and that stillness speaks volumes. As the waves roll against the coast of Venezuela, they sound like applause now, gentle, infinite, forgiving. The sea keeps the rhythm, the people keep the name. And somewhere beyond the noise, beyond the stadium lights and the endless chase for more, there's the quiet spirit of a man who threw his last pitch to the sky. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now, you know.